Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite short story writer, Edgar Allan Poe, the grimly, ungainly, ghastly poet of yore. It is difficult to approach Poe without approaching his biography, and the story is that it is split. It is a mixture of some truth and some falsehood. It goes a little bit like this. Was Poe a craftsman, a literary professional, an artist and critic? Or was he more of a drug addict, troubled, incestuous, definitely perverse, possibly insane, and undoubtedly morbid? Of course, the answer to this is he was a little bit of both. But what you may not understand is that the legend has gotten far more press than it ever should have received. And there he is, our picture of him, as in some ways distorted as this picture. So the man, basically he was the son of itinerant actors, and he was luckily enough adopted by John Allan, who was able to give him an excellent education, and of course he excelled in languages, but he had this darker side to his personality. I think that there's enough evidence in his background to argue for some tendency to addiction. Early in his career, he published a book of poetry. In fact, this is what started it. He joined the Army, he resigned, he was nominated to West Point, and in the process, he published a second book. He kept quarreling with his adopted father, John Allan, and of course, this relationship was troubled, primarily because he did not conform to the expectations of his father. I'm sure his gambling and his addictive behavior was an issue. However, he deliberately disobeyed orders in order to get dismissed from West Point. So he was probably trying to satisfy and please someone else in the process of discovering who he was. Sound like a familiar situation? In 1831, he moved to New York and published the poems. And there he is as a young man. In his middle career, he began his life as a literary critic. He worked for the Southern Literary Messenger as a contributor, then an editor. Also around this time, he married his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem, and he had already moved to Baltimore at this time. I am going to speed over the fact of Virginia being 13 for just a minute. Let me just say that as he left the Messenger, he did have disagreements with the editor, and this was indeed partly because of his drinking. He began hack work in order to make a living. He was, however, successful in publishing stories and always continued to do so for all of his life. In 1839, he published The Fall of the House of Usher, the story we're reading for tomorrow. And in 1839 appeared his first collection of short fiction, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Briefly speaking, arabesque means, of course, something related to, for instance, exoticness or the exotic lands of the Middle East. Now, let's go back to Virginia. First of all, the standards in those days were quite different from they are today. Number one, it wasn't uncommon for people to marry their first cousins. This was done widely in Europe. Secondly, the age of consent was much lower. I'm sure that this was a legal age of consent. It was, of course, not conventionally done, and probably he received some raised eyebrows because of it. Later in his career, he was a reviewer for Graham's magazine. This is when he wrote the first detective story and when his wife became ill. Now, apparently he had some health problems, and it's unspecified what they were. He left Philadelphia in 1844 and moved back to New York. He received some critical acclaim and became famous, of course, for his reading of The Raven. Again, he took up editorship of the Broadway Journal. But a very strange thing happened late in his career, and this is a quotation. Out of perversity, anxiety, strategy, or some combination of three, he gave the disastrous reading of the Raven at the Boston Lyceum. Now, you have to understand that this is the most prominent and highly regarded literary venue of the time, and he basically gave a very poor reading, and it seemed to be that it was deliberate. So obviously, there was some evidence for odd behavior and acting out, perhaps, but mostly speculation. In 1847, Virginia died, and of course, as you might expect, he was devastated. In 1848, he wrote a very obscure prose poem that detailed his theory of the universe. Very few people, except for Poe scholars, read it today. I myself have never read it. What I have seen of it seems awfully strange. In 1849, he had a turn of heart. He became engaged to his childhood sweetheart, and taking a trip to Baltimore, he solicited, or began to solicit, support for a new literary project. Things were looking up, and that was when he was found unconscious the morning after polling day, election day. He had been drunk. He died a few days later of what the coroner said was congestion of the brain, but we now know is alcoholic poisoning, or alcohol poisoning. Now, it's time to look at what contributed to his reputation. Certainly, he was a person of notoriety even without any help. But really, what really cemented his reputation as this odd combination of destructive behavior and acting out, his reputation as being difficult, a drug addict, and so on, was Rufus Wilmot Griswold, who in many ways was not just his literary executor, the legal stance of a person given the right to take care of affairs once a person or a writer has passed away, but he was also out for Poe's reputation. They met in 1841 and never got along. Poe saw him as a literary dilettante, which meant he was an amateur. So they had a critical feud for many years. Poe wrote a satire of Griswold's anthology of work, and possibly there was a love triangle with one Mrs. Frances Sargent Osgood. Again, this is speculation. However, this is not. There was indeed critical debate. His legacy was this very famous obituary. Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. It was signed Ludwig, but everybody knew it was him. Now, the weirdest thing is that he managed to secure rights to publish a posthumous collection of Poe's works. And what's even odder is that there's no real evidence that Poe appointed him. And this, of course, comes from an article entitled Poe and Griswold, whose authors now escapes me, but I believe is concluded on the works cited. Griswold's memoir of the author was published in 1850, and it was an exaggerated account, and this is to whom and to what we have our legend. Poe's choice not to return to the University of Virginia became expulsion. Poe's honorable discharge from the Army became desertion. And, of course, this is what ended in the split. By praising Poe's writing and attacking Poe's character, Griswold let legitimacy to the account of Poe as this wildly perverse drug addict who nevertheless somehow, by pure inspiration and genius, was able to produce good work. Of course, such an account discredited and led our view of him as a competent literary artist and critic. Now, this, of course, is a still from the film The Raven with John Cusack. Notice that he's holding a red mask, and of course that's allusion to the Mask of the Red Death. Interestingly enough, this is an allusion to the story The Pit and the Pendulum. This person here is strapped to a table, and we see a man walk out of the room in a previous scene, and then the pendulum begins to swing, and of course with predictable results. Of course, what people don't understand and don't get is that this anonymous, unfortunate victim's name is Rufus Wilmot Griswold. And here he is looking contemplatively at his raven. So, moving on to other of his writings, which of course help us understand him as not just a short story writer, but as an artist in general, and as a critic. He wrote an interesting piece called The Philosophy of Composition. In it, he details the method and theory for his composing fiction. He uses the example of the raven, debunking his artistic frenzy, like he just overnight came up with the idea. In fact, what he accounts in this essay is very logical, methodical, and deliberate. He says, I prefer commencing with the consideration of an effect, and thereby he conceived of and discusses what we now refer to as the unity of effect. That is, that a unity of impression will be impaired if the work in question is too long to be read at one sitting. Everything in that work must contribute to one overall effect. Short stories, poems, in short, the vast majority of his work would in fact fit this sitting time. All right, some other popular representations of Poe in popular culture. Homer Simpson, of course, and a little bit more romantic version over here. The funny one, quoth the raven, nevermore. So if you've not read The Raven, you really must. I believe that's also in our anthology. Okay, and here's some trailers or movie posters from The Raven. I saw the film, and actually it's quite entertaining, and it's particularly entertaining if you've read a number of Poe's stories. The basic premise is there's a murderer afoot, a serial murder. And this particular serial murderer is systematically emulating, copying the manners of death as described in each one of Poe's stories. A detective, of course, brings in Poe in order to try to catch the killer. Of course, here he is, consummate journalist and literary professional. Here he is, give me another drink. No, you're cut off. Another aesthetic principle, beauty as an effect. Poe claims that beauty is the sole legitimate province of the poem, and that the purest and most elevating pleasure is that derived from contemplating the beautiful. So, and this is one of the reasons I put this slide in this presentation, beauty elevates the soul, not the intellect or heart, and truth elevates the intellect and passion the heart. Now, if you are after the effect of truth, if you are after achieving truth, that is better done in prose. In short, unlike the Romantics, Beauty, Truth, and Truth, Beauty, from Keats, a bad paraphrase, he says that there's a difference. Truth is the province of the essay, or prose, whereas beauty is the effect of poetry. And never the twain shall meet. This is a portrait of Lygia, the subject and title of one of Poe's other short stories. The topic is, of course, the death of a beautiful woman. So along with unity of effect, beauty as an effect, he talks about tone, which is the attitude of an author towards his subject or towards the characters towards one another. And this is what he says. All experience has shown that this tone is one of sadness. Beauty of whatever kind in its supreme development invariably excites the sensitive soul to tears. And the most melancholy topic, then, is the death of a beautiful woman. So in other words, if you're trying, the easiest way to achieve melancholy is to write about the death of a beautiful woman, which of course has interesting implications for our understanding of how women are represented in literature. Of course, this is an incubus, but it also portrays the death of a beautiful woman. In effect, Poe's theory of the unity of effect has been taken to mean that all elements of the work must contribute to the achievement of a single effect. A writer achieves a certain tone largely based on the style of his or her language, diction, syntax included. Insofar as Poe involves topic, unity of effect also implies contribution of plot, characterization, and dialogue. Now, this is the subject of your essay quiz tomorrow. I want you to apply, or at least look for the elements in the fiction you read, either Fall of the House of Usher or another one of Poe's stories, and apply it. In other words, what theme do you see, and how is that theme built? and you're to single out individual elements such as characterization, plot, setting. However many you can manage, probably won't be able to do all of them, but I would start with detailing at least 3, and if you're lucky, you'll get to write in depth about 2 of them. All right? But what you should be keeping in mind as you choose these elements is whether or not they contribute to an overall effect. All right? If you have trouble with, assessing that, then just start with a theme and see how that theme is conveyed. The Fall of the House of Usher. Now, Poe's fiction is diverse. Man of the Crowd and The Purloined Letter are detective stories. The Fall of the House of Usher partakes of another genre of literature called Gothic. Now, and a sensation fiction. I won't go into depth on these topics simply because of time, but they were popular later in the late 18th century and became a big thing in the 19th. So in some ways, Poe's fiction was sort of sandwiched in between the Gothic novel craze and the later, much later actually, 19th century interest in sensation fiction, which was fiction that was supposed to affect you or affect your senses. In other words, bring chills, make the hair on the back of your arms stand up, and that kind of thing. The Gothic novel had a certain plot and characters: mad monks, castles, ruined abbeys, superstition, delusion, hidden corruption, and human anxieties. And not only that, it often featured a troubled but heroic female heroine. It did influence later sensation novels, featuring melodrama, extremes, and the thrill of the physical senses. So, some of the elements. For instance, the setting. The house itself is symbolic of the family Usher. There's the House of Usher as well as the literal house. It's cracked and on the brink of extinction. The characters: an unnamed narrator whose point of view is for the reader only. Roderick and Madeline are both sickly. One is dead in the course of the story and the other dying. The plot. The narrator comes to renew Roderick's spirits. Rod's twin, that is Madeline, dies and is buried in a sealed vault. Rod more or less acts out with art and music, strange and difficult to understand. The narrator himself is caught in this sort of contagion of Roderick's. And then, of course, the suspenseful ending: Madeline reappears and actually falls on Roderick to both of their deaths. And here they are. In this particular stage production, you notice how he is raised and you notice how pale they both look. One of the interesting and somewhat popular but not completely founded interpretations of this story has to do with the fact that maybe Madeline, in fact, is a vampire. The critics, especially the formalist critics of the early 20th century, absolutely adored Poe because he was their pet in the sense that all of his elements contributed to one overall effect, which they saw as the vital requisite of all works of art. That in fact there was an organic unity, and this of course was a major principal assumption of the new critical school. Here's a quotation from from Darrell Abel, who wrote a book for Twain called 20th Century Interpretations of Poe, or actually literally The Fall of the House of Usher. The tale is a consummate psychological allegory which produces its intended totality of effect by perfectly unobtrusive means. Well, Poe is the art which conceals art. So in other words, you're not conscious of his artistic conventions, which I think is difficult to maintain. I don't think once you start looking for them, I think it becomes very difficult not to notice them. However, his purpose is not to make you aware that you're reading a fiction, but to actually transport and experience that fiction. Here is my works cited. I wish you all the best on deciding whether you're going to write about a Poe story or you're going to attempt to view or see or read an adaptation. Thanks very much. I'll see you tomorrow.